Thank you for joining today. The webinar we're going to be talking about is demystifying the GPP and MSPA. Couple quick housekeeping items. If you have any questions, feel free to use the questions or chat within the tool itself, and we'll do our best to answer those throughout the webinar. As we move forward, just by way of quick introductions from the team, I'm Jeff Wheeler. I'm the Global Vice President of Product at Didomi. I've been in the privacy space for about 10 years, building out various CMPs. So really happy to be here. And from here, I'll hand it over to Tony to introduce himself.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for having us. I'm Tony Ficarota. I'm IAB's Assistant General Counsel.
Hi, everybody. Rowena Lam, Senior Director of Product, Privacy and Data at IAB Tech Lab.
Hi, I'm Michael Hahn, Executive Vice President and General Counsel of the IAB and IAB Tech Lab. And Jeff, thanks so much for having us here today.
Thank you, guys. We really appreciate this. I know this is quite the interesting topic for a lot of the industry right now, and I can tell you from Didomi standards or comments and questions we've had from our customers, this would be extremely valuable. Before we get into the details of the webinar, let me just do a quick introduction of who we are as Didomi, and then give the IAB and the Tech Lab team a chance to introduce themselves as well. So Didomi, we're a CMP that's based out of Paris, France. We were founded just prior to GDPR in 2017. We're a global platform around consent, choice, and preference management. As you can see here on the slide, we're recognized in about 27 different countries. We support multiple languages, and we cover about 2% of the traffic worldwide that see our consent and preference experiences, to the public. Michael, let me hand this over to you. Maybe you can let us know and introduce IAB a little bit.
Sure. So the IAB is a not-for-profit trade association that represents the entire digital advertising supply chain, from publishers to advertisers, their agencies, and the ad tech companies sitting in between. We really work very hard to use this big tent approach to solve big macro industry problems, and our efforts very much in the Legal Affairs Council, which Tony and I help lead, is to try to guide the 350 lawyers that are involved in that working group with creating industry solutions to privacy challenges, the MSPA being one of them, which we'll be talking about today. But we also do some other important projects, such as Project Crosswalk, which covered privacy in CTV, and our prior work product from a year or so ago, the Cross-Jurisdiction Privacy Project.
Great. Thanks, Michael. And Rowena, why do you want to give us a background on Tech Lab?
Yeah, sure. So the IAB Tech Lab is a member-driven consortium with over 750 global companies participating in more than 20 working groups on various topics. And our goal is to develop interoperable, efficient technical standards that enable growth and trust in the digital media ecosystem. Some of the specifications that you all may be familiar with that are stewarded by the IAB Tech Lab include OpenRTB, ads.txt, OMSDK, and of course the GPP, which is what we will be talking about today.
Great. Thanks, Rowena. And what you guys will see here before we get into our first question for our panel today, we'll be posting a couple polls throughout the webinar, so we can kind of get an understanding and maybe answer some of your questions. So first poll that you'll see up on the chat is, what is your role within the company? As you guys are beginning to answer that, Michael, why don't we throw the first question over to you, and maybe you can give us an understanding of what really is why is privacy in digital advertising so complicated?
Well, I think Tony's going to sort of jump in on these slides, but I'll let him take the lead on it. Tony?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Michael. Today we're going to be talking about some compliance tools that the IAB and the IAB Tech Lab have developed. That's the Global Privacy Platform and the Multi-State Privacy Agreement. And we need specific technical and organizational solutions to achieve compliance for digital advertising because it's a very complicated ecosystem. And to give you a sense for what makes it complicated, we're going to talk through kind of a ubiquitous data flow in digital advertising, which is just basic digital ad serving. So in a way, this is kind of agnostic as to whether it's personalized advertising or contextual advertising. It's kind of agnostic as to whether that advertising is being served in a mobile app, on a CTV, or on your web browser. A lot of the same fundamentals are true of the data flows for most digital ads transactions. So we want to kind of give you a sense for what's involved at that high level. And this always starts with an advertiser's decision to run a digital ad campaign. And when advertisers do that, the first thing they have to do is create a digital file that contains their ad creative. So if they want to show you a banner ad on the web, they have to create a digital file. If they want to show you a video advertisement in CTV, they have to create a video file. So they work with their agencies to do that. And then once they have that digital file, they share it with a vendor called an advertiser ad server. And the job of that vendor is to store all of the advertisers' creative files and make them ready and make them available to be shown to users on their internet connected devices when they visit those media properties in real time. And after the advertiser loads its creative files up with its ad server, it works with another vendor called a DSP, which is short for demand side platform. And what the advertiser does with the demand side platform is it makes decisions about what kind of audience it wants to reach with those advertisements and how much it wants to pay to show advertisements to that audience. So it goes to the DSP and sets parameters like, what kind of geographic region do I want to show my ads in? Is it going to be the US? Is it going to be a specific state, a specific zip code? They're going to want to sometimes select demographic features of their audience, like a certain age range that they'd like to show their advertisements to. And if there's data available to do it, they may also want to reach particular interest segments, like users that are interested in sports or fashion or cooking or whatever the case may be. And then they set, rules about how much they'd like to pay for those advertisements when there's an opportunity to show one to a user. So all this is going on in the background before a user ever opens up an internet connected device and views ad supported media. But once the advertiser is at this point, what they have is a creative file ready to be shown to a user. They have campaign parameters set up with their DSP. And so then we move over to what happens from the user experience perspective. And what you'll have is a user open up an internet connected device and start browsing the web, for example. And the user is going to open up that site and there are going to be ads on that site. But the ads on that site are often not pre-selected. What's there on the site is an opportunity to show an ad, not a specific advertisement that's selected ahead of time. So what happens instead is in real time, there's an auction that takes place where the advertiser, in our example, and many other advertisers do that may be bidding on the same ad space, conduct an auction. And here's how that works. The publisher will send a call for an advertisement, basically raising its hand and saying, I have an opportunity to show an ad to this user here. And they send that call out to a vendor called a publisher ad server that helps them manage their ad inventory. What happens here for the first time, though, and it's really important to recognize for privacy compliance purposes, is that the information that goes out in that ad call is generally going to be personal information under privacy laws in the US. So we're talking about IP address, device IDs, other proprietary IDs that the publisher may have, along with context about the content that they're viewing on the website. So that has to go out to their ad server to allow this process to continue. And next, the publisher ad server is going to forward that bid request on to an SSP, which is short for supply side platform. And what the supply side platform does is it aggregates available ad inventory from publishers all across the web. So it's not just this publisher, but it could be hundreds or thousands of different publishers that have ad inventory available at a given time. And the SSP's job is to aggregate all of it and help run the auction to select which advertisers' ads are going to be shown to which users in real time. And note here that the very same personal information is going to flow between the publisher ad server and the SSP, the same device ID, IP address, and so on. Next, the SSP is going to forward that bid request over to the DSP. So this is the first time you have personal information leaving a publisher vendor and going over to an advertiser vendor. And what the advertiser's vendor is going to do with this, remember the DSP has all the campaign parameters already set. They know what the advertiser wants to bid on in terms of what kinds of users they want to reach. And so what the DSP will do is conduct a process called audience matching. They will take the information in the bid request, like a device ID and an IP address, and match that against a list of known devices or known users that the DSP has. So they might say, well, actually, I recognize this user or this IP address. I've seen it before, and I have data associated with that user. For example, you might know based on their IP address what region they're in, or you might from information from a data supplier knows certain demographic or interest information about them. And that allows the DSP to determine whether the user that's on that website is within the advertiser's target audience. And those campaign parameters were already set ahead of time by the advertiser. So the DSP just does the work of matching that user up to an advertiser's target audience. And assuming they are in the advertiser's target audience, the DSP is going to return a bid response to the SSP, basically saying, I want to bid on this user. Here's how much I'm willing to bid to show them an ad. And along with that, they're going to share what's called an ad tag, which is a piece of code that allows the actual ad creative file to be pulled down from the advertiser ad server and shown to the user. The SSP is going to conduct an auction. That's what you see in step 9 there. They're going to collect bids from not just this DSP, but from many different DSPs representing different advertisers. And this is a price discovery process. The SSP, or in some cases, it's going to be an exchange, but for simplicity, we're just putting that into the SSP bucket. They're going to collect all these different bids and find out who bid the most. And once they find out who bid the most, that's the ad opportunity that gets selected. And the ad tag gets forwarded on to the publisher ad server. It gets delivered to the website. And then when the ad tag is delivered to the website, that little piece of code executes on the website and calls out to the advertiser's ad server to request the actual media file to be delivered. So if it's a video, the video will be shown. If it's an image, the image will be shown. If you're on a podcast, the audio will play. But that's where that process happens. And so what it's important to recognize through this kind of Byzantine process is that ads are selected in real time in this process. They're not pre-negotiated in this example. And that in order to execute this real-time process, user personal information has to go through several hops between publisher vendors, and advertiser vendors. And as we're going to be talking about in more detail in a bit here, all of these are potentially sales or shares of personal information under the California privacy law, and they may also be processing of personal information for targeted advertising under other state privacy laws. So it's important to be able to go through the analysis of those issues in each step where personal information is being shared and make sure you have a mechanism to engage in that data processing in a compliant way. And so that's what we're going to be talking about with the MSPA and the GPP, how they assist in allowing folks to conduct those transactions in a compliant way. I'll hand it over to Rowena now to talk about the technical part of that, the global privacy platform.
Great, thanks, Tony. That was a really good recap as well. Just a reminder, to the attendees, please feel free to ask questions. We'd like to make this as interactive as possible as well. As I'm sure there's quite a few questions, so we're happy to answer those. So I guess Rowena, going over to you, maybe give us some background on really the reason the GPP was developed.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, happy to. If we rewind to just a few years ago, what we were experiencing and seeing were new and evolving data privacy regulations, first with the GDPR and then the CCPA. And there was sort of a scramble as an industry to find a way to get to compliance. And so it was pretty clear that we needed a technical solution that could account for new and evolving regulations. And we needed a sustainable approach to that. Otherwise, what we were facing is having to potentially implement different technology for each market and maintain them, which would be really time consuming for the industry and costly, and also really difficult considering the complexity of personal data flows that Tony just walked us through, even for just basic ad surveying. And so at the IAB Tech Lab, we started the Global Privacy Working Group, which brought together product engineering, other technologists, privacy professionals representing different parts of the industry. And this is the mission of the working group, to streamline technical privacy standards into a singular protocol and set of tools which can adapt to regulatory and commercial market demands across channels. And this group developed over several years the Global Privacy Platform, or the GPP. I'm going to start using that shorthand from moving forward, GPP, to help the industry comply with privacy regulations across the globe. That's the background as to why.
Great. Great insight. Obviously that leads into the next question that we have here on the screen is, explain to us, maybe break down, in detail for us, what is GPP?
Yeah, happy to. So what it is it is an adaptable channel agnostic protocol for signaling user privacy preferences throughout the supply chain. And it supports multiple channels. So whether you operate on web or mobile or CTV, the GPP protocol can be used. The protocol supports existing privacy signals like IAB Europe's TCF, which I'm sure many folks in attendance today are familiar with. And then it features flexible architecture, making it ready to support new regional signals without the need to start from scratch each time. I also like to mention what the GPP is not, just based on questions that I've heard to date. The first is that it's not a global privacy policy, and in fact, it's not a privacy policy at all. It's also not a centralized user interface or portal. So implementers of GPP or adopters of GPP are not actually implementing a portal or user interface that is displayed to consumers. That's where folks like Didomi can help. But website owners still need to define what the UI looks like for how they will collect the actual user preferences. And then GPP is the protocol that can be used to then communicate that down to the rest of the ecosystem. And then last, GPP is not a one-size-fits-all markets design. So obviously different regional privacy regulations have different requirements on what sort of transparency, consent, opt-out, etc., what have you, that need to be collected and communicated. And the GPP is not aiming to consolidate that. So in a nutshell, what the GPP is doing is providing the industry with a standard format for communicating user privacy preferences throughout the supply chain.
Great, thanks. That's a great recap. One of the questions that came in for the team, I think is interesting, and I'll ask it now, and maybe we can get to the answer. But in general, what I've actually heard asked quite a bit, and what came in through the questions was, how is GPP, also going to support things like automated opt-outs, GPC signals, and like kind of future work with that, right? I know we'll be talking a little bit of roadmap here shortly, but I think that's a question that gets answered, quite a bit. Do they work hand in hand? We've also heard somewhat, how do they work with things like maybe like self-regulation programs and other things like that?
I can talk about GPC and how it works within GPP. So GPC signal, and we'll talk about the actual GPP string and GPP signal in a moment, and maybe it can be a little bit more clear at that point. But the GPP does support GPC signals, meaning that within the GPP string, in certain states where applicable, the GPC signal is passed as a subsection in the string. But that will probably, again, make a little bit more sense once we dive into the meat.
Yeah, great. No, I think that's helpful for us to kind of keep in mind as we move in. One more question that just came in, and maybe I'll let you guys answer first, and then I can also kind of throw in the Dodomi perspective. How is this different and or complementary to a CMP? And I think you kind of touched on it on a little bit of that last slide that you talked about, but let me hand that off to the IAB and Tech Lab team, and then maybe I can throw in the Dodomi perspective as well.
Yeah, so the GPP protocol is what CMPs will often build, is the standard that CMPs are building on top of, right? So can a website owner decide that they want to implement GPP on their own? Sure, but often that, depending on resources, complexity, right? Many website owners or digital properties may choose to work with a CMP to implement GPP. And so GPP is the protocol that CMPs build on top of.
Sure. Yeah, and I think from like the CMP perspective, right, from a Dodomi perspective, the way that we've seen the market shift, especially in the last couple of years, is not only in Europe where we've had consent and CMPs for quite a lot of time, and you've had very regional specific rulings, but now we've seen this plethora of states in the last 2 years pass regulations, and the complexity around consent has become even more difficult. And the fact that I think you touched on your slide, Rowena, there's certain parts of the specific regulations that may not apply to GPP or that may not. It's very complementary, and really it's a tool that CMPs can use to elevate what we offer, because there's always a natural thing with CMPs where implementation is very difficult, and GPP is one of those tools that actually helps us as a CMP offer a better experience, not only to our customers, but actually that end consumer as well when they're interacting with cookie banners and preference centers. Okay, we have a couple more questions going on right now. Why don't we get into the next question real quick? And I think after this section, it'll help us answer some of these questions that are coming in. So maybe Rowena, walk us through, how does GPP work?
Yeah, sure. So I sort of alluded to this based on that last question, but one of the core components of the GPP is the string. And so this is the GPP string concept. The GPP string is the representation of the user's privacy preferences. And so there's information stored in the string separated into different sections. The very first section of the string is always a header. And we can think of the header as sort of a table of contents, and it tells you what other information is included in the remaining sections of the string. Any sections that follow the header are distinct sections of privacy signals that represent a specific region. So here you can imagine that section 1 encoded value may be the TC string, for example. Or you can imagine that section 5 encoded values may be a California section string as an example. And this is where within the California section string example, a GPC signal could be included as well. And so what the GPP string is the concatenation of that header, the table of contents, and then each discrete section with a tilde character used as a separator. And so what we do with the GPP is we define the structure of that string that we were just taking a look at so that all ad tech vendors implementing the GPP can read and decode the string to understand what those users' preferences are. And so we take just a slightly closer look at the GPP string. The header, again, is a table of contents, pretty straightforward, contains just 3 pieces of information. The first piece of information or the first field is self-identifying it as a GPP string. The second field is the version of the specification that was used to create the string. And the last field are the discrete sections or region signals that are contained in the string. And each region, so I mentioned TC string earlier, or California section string, each one of those are considered regions, and each region signal is assigned a distinct section ID. And that's what we use to include in the header. And then for each discrete section, here is where that flexibility that I mentioned earlier comes into play. So there's flexibility for specific fields, data types, and values to be defined for each region. But there is a standard list of available data types And this is where standardization makes adding support for new regions a little bit simpler. So each of those regions sections can be updated and their version independently. So it can be modified without the entire string needing to be updated as a section needs to be updated. So creating a GPP string, in most cases, I think most folks on the call wouldn't have to deal with this. This is where you know, a CMP like Didomi can take on the lift, but it's actually pretty straightforward. The way to do it is we're creating a bit representation of the values for a discrete section, and then base64 encoding it, and then we do that for each discrete section. Then we do the same exact thing, so creating a bit representation for the header section and base64 encode that as well. And then the last thing we're doing is concatenating all of these sections using the tilde character as a delimiter. So again, the GPP string, core component of the GPP. But in addition to defining the structure for the string, what the GPP also does is then actually define those transport mechanisms. It's great that we have the string which communicates the user's privacy preferences, but how do we actually get that to everyone in the ad tech ecosystem, right? The first of these is the CMP API. And so the GPP includes a specification for the API that defines the standard commands that we can see on the screen that must be supported by website owners or their CMPs. And this is what allows ad tech vendors who have on-page access to get the GPP string and then ultimately understand what the user's preferences are. For those who participate in OpenRTB, you can get the GPP string from the regs object. And then those who can't call the API or get the GPP string from the bid request can use standard parameters and macros to get the GPP string.
Cool. That was a great overview, Runa. So we do have a couple more questions that have come in. I'm going to start with Andrea, as you touched on this one a little bit, but how will new regional privacy signals be added to GPP?
That's a great question. And so Tech Lab obviously does not interpret law or make any decisions about what needs to be included in a privacy signals. And so we work really closely, for example, with the IAB. We've got Michael and Tony on who've developed the MSPA. And in support of the MSPA, for example, we created the 5 state level privacy strings, as well as a US national optional privacy string that can be used. And generally, that's how it works, right? We at Tech Lab, again, don't do this in a silo and on our own. We definitely work with like regional authorities on the topics to develop signals for a specific region.
Perfect. Okay. And then the next question was from Aaron. What is the latency and overhead of GPP, and does it differ when used for CTV as opposed to a traditional web-based advertising?
That is a great question that I don't know that I have an answer to right this second, but can certainly follow up.
Okay.
It's not meant to be heavy, right? Like that's
yeah.
the point.
But I think there's also a lot to that question, right? Because you could probably put as much of that question on a CMP as well, right? Time to load the CMP, time to block. You know, some of those. There's a balance here, I think, between what GPP relies on and you know what is the web performance of a CMP's tool. Okay, and then last question, and I'm going to tee this one up as we go into, you know, what is the difference between TCF and GPP? I know we've got one slide on this one, but as part of that lead in, you know, for the team, you know, how does vendor registration for GPP differ from registration for the TCF 2.0 and upcoming 2.2?
That is a really great question. In general, participating with any specific region's frameworks still happens at that level. The only difference is that within the GPP, we've consolidated the vendor IDs. So if you are participating in every region that the GPP supports, and that's, all of the frameworks that the GPP supports, so that's the MSPA, TCF Europe, and TCF Canada. As a vendor, you would have a single ID to use across all frameworks. However, in order to participate in each one of them, you still have to register for, I should say, TCF Europe, TCF Canada separately, and then also be a signatory to the MSPA separately. So your registration process doesn't change. In other words, if you choose to use TCF within GPP, your registration to participate in that is the same.
Great. Okay. That looks like all the questions for now. So now we can move into this next set of questions. Let's talk about the difference between the two strings, TCF and GPP.
Yeah, so both are obviously mechanisms for communicating user preferences throughout the ad supply chain. The TCF, I'm sure everyone here is aware, but was developed to comply with e-privacy and GDPR. But as I mentioned at the very start of the webinar today, it was pretty clear that organizations needed to comply with more and more data privacy regulations globally. And so there needed to be a single protocol that could be used for any jurisdiction moving forward. And so what the GPP is it's multi-jurisdictional, and it supports multiple regions' privacy signals. And we just talked about a few, right? Like there's TCF Europe, TCF Canada is something that new to GPP, and obviously the 5 U.S. state signals, as well as the U.S. national signal as defined by the MSPA, which we're going to hear about in a moment, is supported as well. So those are the, I would say, primary differences. And a comment I'll just make, because I hear this or I get asked this too, is for anyone who's thinking about transitioning from TCF to GPP, like what are they realistically doing? And so the main difference when you think about TCF to GPP is the API is changing. So you would be using a different API instead of calling the TCF API, you'd be calling the GPP API. And then in terms of the string, the standalone TC string wouldn't be used. Instead, you would use the GPP string, which is essentially a concatenation of that header that we looked at, and then the TC string. So the encoding of the TC string itself, which is a distinct section within the GPP, is unchanged. So the only difference between, if we think of it that way, and I'm like really simplifying it, but the difference between a GPP string that is compliant with TCF and a TC string is that header. It's that addition of that.
Great. So Andrea actually gave us another perfect lead-in also to explanation of MSPA. In this next section, we'll talk about that. But as we talk about that for the IAB team, Andrea's question is, can we use GPP without a signatory to MSPA?
The answer is yes. The GPP is a means of communicating privacy signals. There are certain sections within the GPP that are tied specifically to the MSPA. So you can't use those signals, such as the MSPA covered transaction signal or the MSPA national approach signals. But you can send the other signals to your partners without being an MSPA signatory. And of course, you'd be relying on your own contracts and your own relationships to manage what those signals mean. So moving into the question, what is the IAB MSPA? So the MSPA is intended to be a industry contract that allows publishers, advertisers, their agencies, and ad tech companies sitting in between to transact for digital advertising inventory in a manner that complies with the 5 new state privacy laws that are coming into effect this year, as well as we will be amending it, of course, with respect to the additional privacy laws, which will become effective between next year through 2026. So the MSPA functions in a manner like what we call a springing contract. And so let's break down what that means. A springing contract means the terms of the agreement get triggered and come into effect upon a particular condition being satisfied. And that condition is that a signatory, who's either a publisher or an advertiser, says, and they denote this through using the GPP string, that this is an MSPA covered transaction. So once they turn that signal on in the GPP, that means that the terms of the MSPA apply, and these are the privacy terms, not commercial terms. That's what you have in your underlying contracts. But the terms of the MSPA will apply and will spring into place and follow the data amongst the signatories in the chain to whom the personal information is being exchanged. One of the provisions of the contract is that you need to be an MSPA signatory in order to send or receive MSPA covered transaction personal information. So that's the overview of what it is, and the MSPA went into effect on January 1st of this past year. Companies continue to sign on. There are somewhere between 11 to 1,200 companies who have signed up to the MSPA. And so diving into a little more detail about what we're doing as it relates to the privacy terms in the MSPA. And what's really important about this is that we create this industry-wide set of transparent and consistent privacy terms that raises the bar for the industry. And this really does a very important thing. So right now, as you can see on the top part of this chart, this is the current state of play in the industry, right? You have publishers who are negotiating with their SSPs around privacy terms. You have advertisers who are negotiating with DSPs around privacy terms, and everyone has contractual obligations that they're putting into place to pass on those terms to other partners. And so that daisy chaining eventually has to fall apart. It's inevitable because you've got different pressure points on different sides of the industry saying you need to pass terms to another. What the MSPA does, as identified in the bottom part of this demonstrative, is that it creates this centralized set of privacy terms so that everyone is on the same page and is on the same set of privacy terms for these covered transactions, which, by the way, has a very important utility for your compliance, not only with respect to the processing of the transaction, but with respect to the diligence that you're now required to undertake of your service providers under each of the state laws, as well as under the CPPA's new diligence requirement that essentially requires a party to do diligence of its partner with respect to the sale of personal information in order to not be responsible for their wrongdoing. So knowing that your partner and your partner's partners are all operating on the same set of privacy terms is one important component of diligence. Another critical component of the MSPA is that it has 2 different modes of operating. So we have first service provider mode, and that is really designed for those advertisers who say, we never want to sell personal information, share personal information as defined under CCPA, or otherwise engage in targeted advertising as defined under the other 4 state privacy laws. And what we're doing with respect to this mode is trying to keep certain essential functions available to those advertisers. And as you can see on the left part of the chart here is that when the advertiser declares that they're operating in service provider mode, That means their partners, let's say a DSP, will function as a service provider and would be a service provider to undertake frequency capping and negative targeting, and to also do all of the ad reporting activities that are really critical to keeping the lights on, from measurement to fraud detection and viewability. So that's what service provider mode is about. We also have another mode called opt-out option mode. And that is for publishers and advertisers who say, I sell personal information, I share for cross-context behavioral advertising purposes in California, or targeted advertising purposes in the other 4 states, and I'm going to provide the consumer with that opt-out. And what we've identified here is that when the consumer opts out on the publisher or advertiser site, and it is a covered transaction by the MSPA, when that consumer opts out, everyone downstream moves into service provider mode and becomes, if it was on a publisher site, the service provider to the publisher, so that you can deliver, for example, a contextual ad, and everyone downstream would then become your service provider for purposes of handling certain ad delivery and reporting functions. It's important to note that in the absence of this, how is a publisher going to be able to deliver a contextual ad through RTB? Because when a consumer opts out of the sale of their personal information, one of the important things to understand is that a contextual ad still requires the disclosure of IP address through RTB. And so the consumer opts out of that. The service provider mode allows for the delivery essentially of a contextual ad or an ad based on first-party data, and to allow the accompanying reporting and delivery functions to continue on. And then, of course, there's a mode of what you can do, identifying when the consumer does not opt out of sales, sharing, and targeted advertising. The only limitation that applies in the MSPA is that it needs to be used for advertising purposes and not for other purposes like providing the information to the government and that sort of thing. So hopefully this gives you a flavor. One probably needs to sit down with this chart for a little bit to digest it, but that's what we're really trying to communicate, that we have real material purpose limitations that are tied directly to the law, enable businesses to continue to operate, but do so in a compliant manner. Another important attribute about the MSPA is that it creates interoperability amongst state privacy laws. So there were a number of members who came to us as we were working through issues in our working group and said, you know, I don't want to, on my back end, basically have to create different sets of rules for different states. It becomes very, very challenging. And we said, okay, we could fix that. We could address that. What one would need to do, and it's kind of like data breach, which is you need to look across the different states and find the highest common denominator across the states as it relates to the privacy requirements. And that's one of the things that the MSPA does. And so you have the option as a signatory who's a first party to either say, I'm going to present, I'll call it a state-specific experience and process according to specific state requirements, or you could choose the MSPA's national approach as well as an option, where we've gone through the effort and identified the highest common denominator, and you would signal that to your partners using the GPP, which actually has a national approach section that's tied to the MSPA.
All right. Jeff, did you want to take any of these questions, or should we keep moving?
Yeah, so why don't we go over a couple of these questions real quick? I apologize, I was having a slow computer there. So first one was from Steve. What is the difference between first-party advertising and targeted advertising? maybe Tony, that's a good one for you since you kind of explained that at the beginning of the presentation.
Yeah, happy to do that, Jeff. So what we mean by first-party advertising is the data used to select what ad will be shown to a consumer is limited only to contextual information available on the first-party page, or a publisher's own first-party information about that user that they might have from their own interactions with the user. So if you have interest information based on your own interaction with the user, like you might have registration information, they might have told you the city they live in, how old they are, etc. If they told you that directly, that's first-party data, and if you select the ad just based on first-party data, it's first-party advertising. Same thing with contextual data. But if you are using any third-party data to select what ad will be shown to the user, then it's third-party advertising. And the distinction is that after a user opts out of sales and targeted advertising, you can no longer do third-party advertising under the MSPA, but you can continue to do first-party advertising.
Great. Thanks for that, Tony. Okay, next question. Can you see if a company who is not a signatory under the MSPA that uses GPP for the U.S. privacy string, and will there be a similar list to the TCF and IAB Europe lists?
So I'll try to answer that question. In order to see who has signed the MSPA, we do have a publicly available signatory identification list. We don't. So you, I guess you could, but if you're asking, can you find out if anyone is using the GPP even if they haven't signed the MSPA? Anyone can use it, so you might see it in traffic that comes from that company, but there's not a separate list that we maintain for companies that use the GPP but that don't sign the MSPA.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that. So the MSPA requires signatories to use the GPP. So if you see an MSPA covered transaction signal, or if you're looking at the IAB Privacy's signatory list for the MSPA, you'll know that they're using the GPP in particular after July 1st. If someone's not a signatory, there is no centralized list, because really at the end of the day, the GPP is a technical specification of published to the marketplace that companies choose to build to. So there is no central repository for who's using it.
And if I can just add on one other thing, because I do realize that this question references the US privacy string. So one point of clarification is that the US privacy string is going to be deprecated and not supported after July 1st. That's what's specified in the MSPA. So it's especially important if you're an MSPA signatory. But I do want to make that clear as well, because in the GPP, there is a section technically today that like quote unquote supports US privacy string. However, that is not going to be continued to be supported after the July 1st date. I just wanted to add that clarity too.
Great. Thanks, guys. So we're off to our last couple of sections. We're starting to run a little tight on time here. So we're going to try to wrap up these next couple of sections. Again, if you guys have more questions, we will try to get to those. But for this next section, for the IAB team, talk a little bit about privacy compliance imperatives and what exactly does the MSPA solve for?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So Michael just spent some time explaining what the MSPA, how it is and how it's structured and how it works. But now we want to talk a bit in more detail about how that structure works to solve compliance imperatives that are posed by state law. And the first compliance imperative that we see in state privacy laws in essentially all the states is a requirement to opt out of sales. And what we've seen from the California regulators to date, since they're really the only ones that have developed any enforcement history with their law, is that the concept of personal information sales has very broad application to digital advertising activities. That includes things like measurement of ads and also frequency capping of ads. And that has to be properly accounted for by industry participants. And this is really a departure from what the traditional status quo has been, where an opt-out for digital advertising meant an opt-out of personalized advertising. But what we want to get through here is that the concept of sales is actually broader than that, and it includes any transfer of personal information from a business to a third party or from a controller to a processor if there's not a proper service provider or processor relationship in place. So to give you a first example, and we're not, again, just in the interest of time, we won't spend as much detail walking through this one. But what we want to demonstrate here is that frequency capping is not targeted advertising. Okay, you could have a contextual ad or a first-party ad, but the advertiser still wants to limit how many times that same ad is shown to a particular user. Many of us have had the experience of having the same ad shown over and over again. That is annoying to consumers and it wastes the advertiser's dollars. So in order to fix that, there's a process called frequency capping, which relies on passing a user ID through the ad tech chain so that you can count how many ad impressions have occurred against that identifier. But in order to do that, as this flowchart kind of demonstrates, you still actually have to pass an identifier from publisher sites who are encountering those users and showing them ads through the ad tech chain that allows for ad selection to occur. And when that personal information passes from the publisher to a vendor, that is de facto going to count as a sale of personal information under the CCPA and the other state privacy laws, because it's a broader concept. It doesn't have to do with targeted advertising per se. And so the way to address this issue is to enter into valid service provider and processor agreements, because under all the state privacy laws, there's an exception to the definition of sale when you have a valid service provider or processor agreement with the vendor that you're passing the information to. But the problem here is that you have vendors not only in a direct relationship with the publisher, but also advertiser vendors like the DSP. So you have data hopping from publisher vendors to advertiser vendors where there's not a pre-existing or natural commercial relationship between those two vendors. And so the MSPA is an important tool to enable companies to fill that gap and cause service provider relationships to spring into place among any one of those entities that is processing the user's personal information, and allow them to continue doing that for purposes like frequency capping and avoid a sale of personal information. And it otherwise would be a sale if you don't have those service provider relationships in place. And the next example of that is measurement. And again, this has nothing to do with the type of advertising that's being shown. It could be a personalized ad or it could be a contextual ad. But in either case, the advertiser still wants to understand how many times that ad has been viewed and by how many different individuals or devices the ad has shown up on, and also what actions users take after they view the ad. Did they click on it? And once they get onto the advertiser site, do they take some other action, like adding something to a cart or making a purchase? All of that information is extremely important for advertisers to understand where they should be spending their ad dollars. And it's very difficult for ad-supported media to continue if advertisers can't measure whether there's any value in placing those advertisements. But even in order to measure the ad, it still involves passing those device identifiers from the publisher sites where the ads are being shown to a vendor called a measurement company, which is hired by the advertiser to help them count those ad impressions and to do analytics on them. And again, the issue comes here from the measurement company being an advertiser vendor. The advertiser hires and pays them, but the personal information that's flowing to them is often coming from publishers because that's where the impression data is sourced from. And because there's that gap in an advertiser vendor getting information from publishers that they don't necessarily have a pre-existing relationship with, there's a need to get into contractual privity and allow those service provider terms to spring into place after a user opts out of sale, to allow those to continue within the confines of a service provider or processor relationship. So all of this is really just to say that you should be taking a very broad view of sale to follow what the regulators have told us about this in their enforcement actions and guidance. And what that means for the digital advertising industry is you have to look past targeted advertising. You have to be looking at ad delivery, you have to be looking at frequency capping and measurement. If personal information is flowing from one party to another, you have to have a mechanism to put service provider relationships in place to avoid sales. And that's exactly what the MSPA is intended to do for the industry. Michael?
Thanks, Tony. So we're going to try to jump through some of this kind of quick because I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. But one of the important compliance imperatives is around what we call the Section 100D requirements in CCPA, which says that you need to have a contract in place with about a half a dozen different privacy protective provisions every time that you sell personal information or share it for cross-context behavioral advertising purposes. And one of the challenges that exists in the digital ad supply chain is that we typically have contracts where money is exchanged, but there are a number of places where we exchange data in the delivery of a digital ad, but we don't have a contract in place. And so what the MSPA does is helps fill the gap. It has that springing contractual effect in a manner that follows the data to ensure that there's contractual privity that meets the requirement of 100D. So here's one example which involves ad servers. So as you likely already know, the advertiser, they're going to have an ad creative that is going to be sent to their ad server. And then the user is going to visit the site, which on the publisher side is bestrecipes.com. And it is going to say, hey, I've got a slot that needs to be filled. The user's IP address, for example, is going to be sent to the publisher's ad server. And then let's say this advertiser, shoestyle.com, they've won the ad. And now, or they won the opportunity to serve the ad in the bidding process. And now the publisher's ad server is going to call the advertiser's ad server. And in doing so, it is disclosing the consumer's IP address. Well, the problem we have as an industry is that ad servers typically don't have contracts with each other, right? The publisher's ad server and the advertiser's ad server, they don't exchange money. They just exchange data historically. And so the MSPA is intended to fill that gap. And if the publisher signs on to the MSPA, the advertiser signs on to the MSPA, they get their ad servers to sign on to the MSPA, and then there's contractual privity when the data flows between the ad servers. Another example of where a challenge arises that the MSPA solves for as it relates to this contractual privity requirement deals with third-party pixels that are placed into the ad creative. So in this example here, the advertiser has contracts, of course, with a variety of vendors, such as a measurement vendor, a fraud vendor, and they are going to, the advertiser, or often its agency, is going to put these vendor pixels into the ad creative. And then what's going to happen is that the advertiser's ad is going to be delivered onto the publisher site. And when it lands on the publisher site, pixels, these pixels are going to fire from within the ad creative, which creates a sale of personal information of the consumer from the publisher to the advertiser's vendors, or to the advertiser itself, because the vendor might be a service provider to the advertiser, as, for example, a measurement company often is. But again, there's really never a contract that's going to exist in this programmatic supply chain between the publisher and these vendors, or with the advertiser. And so what the MSPA does is it fills that gap, so that when the advertiser or its agency puts these pixels into the ad creative, they're going to put the pixels in of companies who have signed the MSPA. So when it fires on the publisher page, that creates a sale between two companies that are signatories, and the MSPA contractual terms will apply. So we're at the top of the hour. One of the other critical things that the MSPA does is that it causes these companies whose pixels are firing the ad creative to first look to see if the consumer has opted out. And they're going to look for the string to see whether there's an opt-out. And if there is, they're not allowed to go ahead and process the consumer's personal information. This is otherwise a significant technological challenge for the industry as a publisher, having advertisers, vendors, pixels fire in the ad creative, notwithstanding an opt-out. So that's one of the things that we try to solve for through the contract. And as we look ahead, know that we've been engaging deeply with the regulators. We've had very good dialogue and educating them, and so far have had a very positive set of responses and feedback from them. We'll be launching a certified partner program for non-signatories soon. And Rowena, maybe you want to just real briefly go through what to anticipate on the GPP side?
Yeah, we do have a update to this CMP API 1.1 coming. I can drop in the chat a blog post where we detail all of the updates that are made to the API.
Jeff?
Great, guys. Well, thank you so much. That's the end of the webinar. Apologies. We went over just a minute or two, but we appreciate everyone's questions and comments. If there's anything outstanding, we can make sure to get those answered to you, through the Didomi or the IAB team. So again, Tony, Michael, Rowana, thank you so much for joining. One last plug, we do have a Yes We Trust webinar coming up, which will be part of our Didomi series of webinars talking about privacy and the user experience in a data-driven world. This will be Tuesday, May 30th at 5 p.m. Central European time. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to register. And once again, thank you to the IAB and the Tech Lab team for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.